So we're having a look at Philippians, and we've been taking on board some lessons from the idea that if you have any encouragement, any comfort, any kind of consolation, any small little glass of water that has replenished your soul that has in some way come from the person of Jesus, some little even speck, then take that, embrace it, and share it. Not the large content, the deep insight, the little bit of consolation, the little bit of truth, the little bit of wisdom, take that and may it nourish you but also nourish others. And then we come into this part of the passage which has this kind of quite full-on journey. I think it's quite in the middle of the book for a very, I think it unwraps the rest of the book, this conversation that is inherently involved with the church who send this guy Epaphroditus, and we're going to all keep smiling whenever I say that. They send this guy to share in the ministry, to share in the journey of Paul, who's enslaved or incarcerated, and they send him off packing with resources. Not like go to Alice Springs, jump in your car, drive for a couple of hours. Probably took weeks and weeks to get there. There was a lot of risk that he wouldn't get there. And that he got unwell was not really that uncommon in that context when you think about it. And it says really clearly, Paul says, he nearly died. So here is the church in Philippi, saying really openly, as best they know how can we help Paul? Let us share in the partnership in the gospel. And they send this guy off and he gathers what he has and they gather what they have and they give it. And for all intents and purposes, it kind of actually nearly ends in an absolute tragedy. Certainly disappointing. And when I read this passage, I'm reminded really consistently that there's actually often experiences that we all take in our Christian journey or in our journey towards Christ, where there is actually often a deep sense of I'm doing what I feel called to do. I believe I'm in the right place. I'm doing it with my whole heart. It doesn't say Epaphroditus was a great speaker or a particularly Christian person. It says that he followed his conviction to share his whole life and nearly lost it. For me, this has some resonance. For those who were here last week, a friend of mine, Glenn, shared something of journeying with Indigenous young people in New Zealand and the journey and story of giving his life really to these young guys. And some amazing stories came out of it. Beautiful stories. In fact, he underplays some of those stories. But he also shares how he poured his life into one young guy who later on in his teenage years goes out and commits a rape, a sexual assault. He felt called to love these young men, to nurture them out of broken homes. He lives in community, lives out his life towards Christ, pours his heart into it, and then there's a great disappointment for him. I was meeting with a friend during the week, a guy who's been in mission for many years, works in community life, shares his life with the marginalised on the edge of the community who face significant disappointment and loss. After 15 years of sharing his life, his young daughter attempted to commit suicide. Loving father, loving parents, facing a significant disappointment and loss. They've had to reorientate all of their ministry construct to try and understand what it is to just be good parents, just to survive this experience. In all intents and purposes, good fruit out of their family's life. Other people would say this person has had significant influence on them as a Christian leader. My question for us tonight is, as followers of Jesus, as people as best we know how, as we come together in our broken selves, we come to Jesus and we often experience loss. This life brings disappointment. Right in the middle, in the heart of the call of God, in every Christian connotation, we face overwhelming odds that are outside of our control. Paul says, and by God's mercy, Epaphroditus, see, I can't say it again, is rescued. Interestingly, my friend shared during the week that some people used that experience that he's had, because they're aware of the struggle that their family are going through, as a catalyst for saying, I'm actually really distancing myself from God. I actually see that as a removal of a God of love and peace. How could God let that happen to you? And I've seen that construct a number of times over the years, where we have a certain way of saying, God, we have expectations on you too. And if you let us down, then where do we go? Interestingly, my friend said to me really clearly, Mike, I don't feel like God's removed. I don't feel like God's not a part of what is going on in my family. I'm deeply afraid. I'm concerned. I want to know what it is to be a good dad in this scenario. But God is not removed. I don't know whether you've had an experience where you've found yourself in the middle of your best understandings of what God has called you to do and faced a struggle and disappointment. To me, it confronts the very values that we construct our Christianity on. And so I thought I'd take us through an exercise, hence the paper and the pen, to how I've explored this inside the construct of the people that God has called me to share my life with. So you've got this piece of paper, so you can fold it in half. It's not origami, it doesn't matter if it's not perfect. You've got a pen. I've named this the Jesus gift. I'm trying to come up with titles for Sydney every week, and it's usually just got Jesus and then something else I can think of. It's called a hidden wholeness. So you draw a circle on one space, one and a half, you've got a circle there. When you came here tonight, you might have been here for the first time, and welcome if you have. You are that circle. Pens? Some pens don't work. So kind of scratch your way round and do the best you can.
Sorry, everyone. I got a pencil.
So you've got this circle, and you are that circle. It's all right, it's not making any kind of image-related connotations. You're the circle. And you've just started church. New church. Come in first time. And you walk in the door, and you meet some guy like me or Shelley at the door, and you go, hello. And you start to get to know people in the church. You know, interesting folks, so you share a little bit about yourself. You share maybe 2 or 3 little aspects of who you are. I'd like you to just jot down in either a square or a triangle or whatever shape you want to put inside the circle a characteristic that you would share about yourself. New group of people, come in, this is who I am. Might be what you do, but think in terms of characteristic. I don't know about you, but I usually share a characteristic that's usually likeable, that other people want to get to know. It's usually my quirky sense of humour that some people get some of the time. And then other people just think I'm quirky and strange. It might be how I share about what I do. It could be that I want you to know that I'm involved with the Aboriginal community. Or it might be something that I do that kind of says, actually, yeah, there's more to me than this. I've still got pen issues? You'll have to share, I'm sorry. So have we got 3 characteristics? Now, my experience, I don't know about your experience at church, was I learned really early on that there were some characteristics that were really good to share, and then there were some characteristics that you just don't talk about. You know the one, if you grew up in church, where you fought all the way on the way to church in the car, and you actually, gave each other a really hard time, and mum told you to shut up, or whatever was going on, and then you got out, and then you got to the front of the church, and then someone said, "How are you going?" And you went, "Oh, yeah, I'm good. Oh, God bless you." And you learnt really good, you got really good, really early at showing game face, game Christian face. You could have been absolutely smashed the night before, seedy as all got out, but you know how to do Christian game face. And you had a nice, pleasant smile on your face, and you went, "This is how I am." But often, not all the time, but often, you would come in and you would start to get to know that church community. You go, "Oh, actually, there's a few parts to myself that I actually think it might be worth letting someone know about." I struggle a little bit with porn sometimes. I don't really want to talk about the fact that actually I've got a bit of an anger issue. Maybe there's a little characteristic there about deception or lying, frustration. So no one's going to see this. And it might be hard if you have to share a pen. But I'd like you to write down 3 characteristics that you would prefer other people not know about. If you're married, your partner, your mother, or whatever is here, just feel free to ask them, because they'll be able to tell you straight away. 3 characteristics that you would go, "Yeah, I know they're there, but I'd really rather not you know about those." I'll give you a minute to do that. Somehow the good ones leap to our mind and the darker ones seem harder to draw out. No one's going to see this, by the way. It's only yours. Well, if you want to show someone, you can show someone. Or you could just show me. No, it's just a joke. So here we have all the different aspects of our lives, all different shapes, sizes, who we are, how we work, how we operate. Some of them people know, some of them don't. What we learn, well, my experience in church was that I actually learned that it was actually good to show these things and then not these things. And so I got really smarter at actually promoting the ones that really made the biggest impact. So I got quite good at the Christianese. I was, had the gift of the gab. So I kind of thought, oh, actually I could talk about this. But the reality was, I'm still that whole circle, aren't I? Made up of lots of different aspects. But sometimes, and this is my experience in coming from an evangelical background, there actually started to be a bit of a line between the parts of who I was that were actually the church parts or the religious parts, or the parts of the community that I wanted people to know about, and the parts that other people, this is not the part that I want you to know about. And so there was a little bit of a line that started to come down. And that line actually, sometimes we could call it sin, but it was certainly the expectations that I needed to have for you to think that I'm a good person. Because it was important, and it is important for you to think that I'm good. And so the parts of me that I didn't want you to know about, I kind of moved over. And over a period of time, particularly if you grew up in the church in your teenage years, in many evangelical constructs, those actually worlds could often become further and further and further apart. So that line actually started then to create two different circles. I could actually become someone completely different in one space and completely different in another. And the expectation was that if I was a really, really good Christian here, that somehow that would make up for being a really naughty Christian over here. Let me share with you a personal journey about how this operated for me. Called into ministry out of a Pentecostal background, I had my first opportunities to speak in churches. Had planted a church. I was kind of president of the Pentecostal Bible College that I was at in my third year, and my marriage broke down. Less than 18 months in, the whole thing went to custard. Early 20s, nowhere to go. There's not a lot of room for wannabe ministers whose marriages break down. I find myself completely lost. Drinking too much, having a background in the background that I had, I just started becoming a doorman, nightclubs. Found my way to the back of a church that said I felt was kind of safe enough. I would sit at the back corner, I would get through the first part of the service, and then they would have like a notices thing, and then me and a group of others would sneak out the back and have a few cigarettes. That was my way of coping with the church service. A couple of cigarettes, how'd you go? What did you do last night? Oh, better go back. I slowly introduced my life into that community, and I would introduce it every now and then by swearing, because it was the best way for me to let you know that I didn't really want to get you too close. This is because people knew my story as well. In fact, I actually turned up to a church one Sunday evening where they used the metaphor of my fall from grace as an example, which would have been good if I wasn't there. But it tells you something about our churches that could even happen. So I would say, hi, I'm Mike, da-da-da-da, and then you would get to know me a little bit, and then I would just say, fuck, just randomly, like that. And then you would go, this guy is a bit obscene, I don't know whether I want to get to know him, and I'd go, that's good. And then some people would deal with it. But that's what I did, I just randomly swear. And it worked quite well. And then slowly, a few people in that church got to know all the different parts of me. The parts that I was afraid of, the parts that I was scared of, the parts that I hid when I was drinking, the parts that I struggled around my sexuality and wondering what that meant to have this in a healthy way. And as I started to face some of those questions and started to open them up, I had to actually confront that, there was some responsibility I needed to take about where I wanted to be and where I wanted to go and who I wanted to share with. And some of it came to a head when I had what I thought was the good Christian story, the restoration story. You know this story really well because you've been in Christian churches. And it was that I thought that my marriage was going to come back together. And so I came back and got up the front and said, the Lord has answered my prayers. We're getting back together. And then a month later, I had to get up again and say, I'm sorry, I got the divorce papers. Will you still pray with me? And the church, with a few tears, just said, Mike, we're still here. They said some other things too. They said, Mike, don't drink alcohol and don't date anyone in this church until you get your shit sorted out. And I thought, okay. And so I stuck it out for a few years. And after a couple of years, they said, you know, Mike, if you want to, we'd like you to finish your degree and be a part-time pastor here. And I thought to myself, I will not be a pastor anywhere else, but these guys know all of my stuff. So what does it matter? They know all of my stuff. If they feel that I'm called to be in a role here, then that's it. That's all. I'd already sworn at nearly all of them at various times. I'd asked for them to pray for me here and pray for me here. And so what started to take place was God started to build out of that brokenness this kind of restoration, but not in the way that I would have thought, not in a resolved way. I've been married now for 17 years, but let me tell you this, I'm still in love with my first wife. I don't believe that you stop loving people that you commit your life to. So I live with that loss. See, for me, a hidden wholeness was coming to some context with the contradictions in my life and finding a space where those contradictions were all right. It's interesting now, as some of my friends in ministry have shared some of their disappointments and losses and changes and shifts over a number of years, I come back to this story. And I came back to this story this week as I was reflecting. Because God is not removed from my fucked life. He is intimately involved and wants to be connected. But not because it's screwed up, but because he sees so much more in me than my expectations of what I could be. And he doesn't need me and you to know that I'm good. He believes I'm good. My role is to surrender my life to him and to live it out as best I know how, and come to his cross daily and surrender again and say, I don't know, I don't think I'm good, but I trust you. And here I am. And so as I go through each of those little characteristics, and I don't need to know them, to know that there should be a cross over each one. And guess what? Some of the good ones are just as sinful as the bad ones. Some of those ones that we project that are the good Christian ways of operating are just as full of BS as the bad ones. And so slowly I built a community of people who I deliberately said, I want you to know me and I want you to be able to speak into my life. Not all people, all the time, a select few, where I slowly started to allow that cross to become a part of those characteristics. Not resolved, not a 12-week program that we do in nearly every church about how to fix your problems and how to resolve your whatever it is that they think that you need to resolve. A way of sitting with the spaces in our lives that we know are not good or healthy or appropriate, but we need a space where we know that the cross is in the middle. 1 John 1:9, he is faithful to forgive those who confess their sins. He sees a wholeness, and I sit with that. And I sit with a few friends who know that. And he creates possibility and beauty that I could never have imagined. I'll come back to that. And so what I started to see as I started to do that, and I did that in the construct of a community, was those two worlds started to slowly come back together. And in fact, the hidden wholeness that I think is in Christ, that allows us to deal with the disappointments and the frailties of who we are, the ones that are in our control and the ones that are out of ours, is the idea that we live with that brokenness every day as we live with the wholeness. We bind ourselves to a broken Christ. In his brokenness, we find wholeness in our brokenness. And so the cycle goes on. And so I'm not really that afraid of your stuff, because I've just got to deal with my own as best I know how. And that's why I like this strange man called Epaphroditus. Because as best I can tell, he just gave what he had, and it nearly all went to custard. but by God's mercy, he was saved. So I've decided to go on this journey with Jesus to live divided no more. I've decided to no longer to act on the outside in a way that contradicts some truth about myself that I hold deeply. And I challenge you to find people who you can live your life with, who you don't have to live in a divided space. And it may be that your worlds aren't really that far apart. I don't know. Maybe there's just a few squiggle lines in some areas. That's not the point. The point isn't the distance. The point is the honesty, the truthfulness, the surrenderedness. You're not more righteous because of the Christian elements any more than the unchristian elements. And so I take this not Christian poet and I read this to you, and maybe it gives you some nourishment as my little consolation. Be patient to all that is unresolved in your heart. Try to love the contradictions themselves. Do not now seek the resolutions which cannot be given because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the contradictions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the resolutions. I lived in a Christian world for many years, studied at Bible colleges, that told me I had to have these things resolved. And when I had them resolved, I then had to share that with you so that you could resolve your stuff. And so he went around resolving everybody's stuff, and then we all had to put up with the fact that everyone had the contradictions going on. What a load of rubbish. Let us live with the contradictions, because Christ lives with the contradictions. Let us accept that honestly and truthfully. And in some strange way, as a community called Leichhardt, find deliberately people who can journey with us and find the resolutions slowly. So when my friend who shared last week shares something of the disillusionment of spending his life raising young men and seeing some of them not go the way he would love, or another friend who's in ministry for many years facing the disappointment of a tragedy or close to a tragedy within his family, I don't see that as being separate to our journey with Christ. I see the opportunity for us to know a broken and authentic leadership that is real about what it is to love and to love ourselves, to be truthful